Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Lonnie. I really want to just turn around those thanks and express my gratitude to both of you and also to the Teagle Foundation and to Cornerstone. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to present, but mostly for this series itself. I have learned from and really been quite inspired by a number of these sessions. Along with other Teagle and Cornerstone programs. So if some of you are new to all of this, new to this community, I'll just say I think you will find it too a true pleasure to be part of this group. I also wanted to say that having attended a number of these quite elegant and erudite talks before, I feel moved to try to lower your expectations about what you're going to hear from me. I think it's really important to say that I am no expert on either of the texts or the authors that I'm going to talk about today, Plato's Allegory of the Cave and Bell Hooks's Democratic Education. So I do want you to know that before I launch in, and I'm now going to see if I can get my screen to share. Let's see. Okay, there we go, and okay. I'm hoping everybody's able to see that, the two works and the two authors I'm going to be discussing today. And you've heard my caveat about not being an expert on either. So as I was preparing this morning, my lack of expertise struck me, though belatedly, as a bit foolhardy. But it was, in fact, by design. And let me explain what I mean by that. When I had suggested these texts to Lonnie last July for this webinar, it was because they were the readings that our instructors had collectively selected to kick off the pilot of a new first-year sequence at Vanderbilt. None of us had taught these texts yet, at least in combination, and none of us, again, were experts, at least with respect to both texts. So I thought it would be interesting to share not just the text, but our experience and experiment in teaching them collectively as something that many of you may be thinking about doing at your own institutions. So I do want to picture the people who I'm talking about here. This is not everybody, but a good chunk, the majority of the faculty teaching in our first year pilot. And so what I thought about when I thought about the title of this talk in my own mind, I retitled it not to how do I teach this text, but how did we teach these texts in fall 2024 for the first time? And I want to tell you a little bit about what our faculty and what our students did with this material. Or to channel bell hooks, I want to tell you what kind of magic was generated in the classroom by putting them together. So a little bit more background on kind of the structure of what we were doing and the goals of what we were doing. The pilot faculty pictured here themselves came from many different disciplines, some from the humanities, from Italian and history and Latin American studies and classics, but others came from anthropology and communications and economics and neuroscience. And I, as one of the directors of the course, was able to peer into all of their classrooms. So some of what I'll share today comes not from me, in fact, it comes from the expertise and creativity of my colleagues pictured here. All of this was in the service of rolling out two common courses that every first-year student at Vanderbilt's College of Arts and Science will take beginning in fall of 2025, so a year from this fall. Our fall course is called Being Human, and our spring course focuses on science, technology, and values. But I'm going to be talking about the first course in the sequence today. And I'll go back to those texts just to put them in front of you. So our intent in beginning the entire sequence for our first year students with these texts, with Plato and Hooks, was really twofold. First, we wanted to signal from the very first day that the questions that we would be taking up in class were some of the biggest and most enduring questions that humans have ever asked. And that these conversations were not ones that could be definitively settled or resolved. And for that reason, they spanned great swaths of time, of geography, of circumstance, of perspective, and so on. And by pairing an ancient Athenian philosopher and a contemporary Black feminist, Black American feminist, writing more than 2,300 years apart, we really hope to make this conversation come alive for students. So that was point one. The other reason we wanted to start with these texts, which was because while both of our first year courses are designed to offer students essential practice in reading and thinking about texts together, we wanted the fall course to begin very deliberately with an invitation to reflect seriously on the purpose of being educated. And to get students thinking about what they hoped for as learners, as thinkers, as scholars, what they hoped for in the next 4 years for their own education. These were matters that students, amazingly enough, have rarely been asked to think about before. And we really wanted to center that as they walked into one of their first college classrooms. And here I should say that this idea was not ours, actually, but I mentioned the amazing Teagle community before, and this really came from talking with colleagues at Stanford who do something similar with the first trimester of their first year sequence. So I thank our colleagues there for lending the idea. But all of this is to say that these two texts coming right at the beginning of the semester had to do a lot of work for us. We had a lot of ambitions loaded on them. So let me move on to the text and tell you a little bit about how this went. So the Allegory of the Cave, as many of you may know, is one of Plato's best known writings from the Republic. It's a common choice of teachers. And so actually what it meant, which was interesting for us, was that it's a text that some students actually come into the classroom, into the seminar room, already having some familiarity with. By no means most of them, but some of them did, sprinkled through our first year pilot students. And in fact, this offered an opportunity early on to really exemplify the democratic education and classroom that Bell Hooks talks about, because we were able to turn sometimes to a student in the class and say, you seem to know something about ancient Greece. What do you know that helps us interpret this text? So that was really wonderful and kind of a surprise. At any rate, the reading takes the form of a dialogue between Socrates and Plato's older brother, and it's a discourse on many different things. You read in these pages about Plato's theory of forms, the question of whether humans can ever get beyond the play of shadows and imitations to grasp at the real. It's a meditation on the nature of the good and the true. And it's also a text that raises questions about how and by whom an ideal city-state ought to be governed. But most importantly for us as the teachers here is that it was a story about the process. It is a story about the process of becoming educated or enlightened. And it's evoked with arresting imagery. Plato pictures a dark cave where prisoners are bound by their necks and their feet, and whose experience of the world comes from watching shadows on a wall. Those shadows are produced from an unseen light source, and that is reflecting off people on the road above. You can see that here, who are walking and carrying artifacts and such. So Plato in the Allegory famously asks us to consider what happens if a prisoner is dragged out of the cave and ascends to the upper world and to the light. Only gradually, he says, and after much resistance and confusion, will the prisoner begin to apprehend that the real world is this one above. He talks about the soul's ascension to the intelligible region. Whereas the world of the cave from which the prisoner was dragged is just an imitation, a mere puppet show. Or in the translation that I sent around, it's a cheat or an illusion. And while no one, having seen the light and having gained this kind of knowledge, would desire to return to the cave, and will also risk being mocked as having his eyes ruined, Plato says, upon returning. Plato says those who would lead the society must return to the cave, must mingle with the prisoners, and must attempt to help enlighten them. So I want to pause and say, I show this image here, but some of our faculty experimented with different ways of helping students visualize this, this really interesting and kind of exotic allegory. One of our faculty members, for example, spent the first few minutes of class challenging his students in pairs to draw Plato's scenario. He had a bunch of colored pencils and pens and paper. And this exercise for students who were just getting to know one another just was really wonderful, and I recommend it. It occasioned a great deal of hilarity, but also quite lively and intense discussion of what each of these elements meant: the cave, the prisoners, the wall, the shadows, the fire, the exit, and so on. And then led to some deeper questions. You know, who structured the world this way? Why were the prisoners in shackles to begin with, and so forth. But it enabled that exercise of having students attempt to visualize Plato's thought world here, enabled a discussion to move very organically to whether this was a picture of learning and education and civil society, and how so. Let me turn now, before comparing these texts and putting them together, to bell hooks. Bell Hooks, as you may know, was born Gloria Jean Watkins. She grew up in segregated Kentucky in the 1950s and 60s, so close to Nashville, actually, but where I live and teach, but a world away from Plato. She grew up in a working class family and earned a scholarship to Stanford as an undergraduate, and then went on to earn her PhD, writing in her lifetime more than 30 books. She was an early intersectional thinker and undoubtedly one of the most influential Black feminist scholars of the last half century. Now, democratic education comes from a collection of her reflections on pedagogy. She really thought of herself first and foremost as a teacher. And it sketches Hooks's vision of how learning best occurs. Importantly for her, learning, and much of learning anyway, happens beyond or before what she calls the institutionalized classroom. And it depends on deep respect for what each person brings to the project, student and teacher alike. And perhaps for her, the most important form of education depends on being able to critique the structure of knowledge itself and knowledge institutions themselves. It is, I think, for students, compared to Plato's Allegory, a deceptively straightforward text. But what we found in weaving together the Hooks and Plato was that they saw more and more depth and kind of interesting complication in what Hooks was trying to express about the importance of a democratic education. So, of course, when you pair two texts like these, it trains the eye on some of the striking similarities and resonances, as well as dissimilarities in these texts. So there was much that we didn't discuss in these texts at all that didn't bear directly on the question of education, which may be worth saying. What these texts did do for us collectively, I'd say, is place the question of what constitutes a real or true education on the table in the first week of college for our students. And this was really wonderful. Of course, as I've mentioned, they worked with these texts to notice some different emphases and possible agreements or disagreements between the authors. You know, is education, true education, possible for all? Does American society resemble a more aristocratic or democratic system of education? And these texts really enabled, I think, students to begin to ask really probing questions of their own education. I wanted to get some pieces of text in front of us here to think about the process by which students started to think through what Plato and Hooks offered us on this score. As you can see in these statements, both authors put education and common ideas about education into question. Education is not in reality what some people proclaim it to be, says Plato. They may think it's about injecting knowledge into a soul that doesn't possess it, but this isn't true, he says. You can't insert vision into blind eyes. Instead, there's an indwelling power in the soul, in maybe every soul, and the instrument whereby each of us apprehends is an eye that could not be converted to the light from darkness except by turning the whole body. So there is something in Plato that suggests that a capacity, an innate human capacity to learn and to be educated, that people cannot be given truth, but can be helped to see it with their own eyes. And that, importantly, this is embodied. One must turn one's whole body and soul toward the light. For Hooks, who says learning is never confined solely to an institutionalized classroom. It's part of our real world experience, our real life. And here's students had some interesting things to say about college being often perceived as not real life. Hooks says learning must be understood as an experience that enriches life in its entirety. Students played with and chewed on this to think about what and how education was part of everyone's experience, something that, as Hooks suggests, could be accessed by all citizens, whether they were in an educational institution or not, so long as they had some things. They had literacy and they had books. This is why Hooks believed public education was the foundation for a democratic society, making learning potentially open to all. So the text, sort of helping students focus on the words in the text was really important for many of our faculty. But again, thinking about the first week or so of school, plunging students into unfamiliar texts and maybe ideas, some of our faculty members took things in other directions. And I wanted to just highlight one of our instructors. Her name is Selena Callahan Kapoor, who really did this wonderful exercise in class with Plato, I guess she was playing with to some extent, but something really tactile to get students to translate the words from these texts, phrases or sentences or passages that really struck them, and to try to put this into three-dimensional form. And here's what Selena said about this exercise. She said, "When I teach challenging theories or concepts, I frequently put students in small groups and give them a prompt that requires them to depict the concept visually or schematically. I tell the students that my reason for doing this type of activity is that depicting something abstract visually can make the concept more tangible, and even more importantly, can show them and can show me, the teacher, parts of the concept that they understand well or don't." So I got to sit in on this class and watch this happening, and it was really a beautiful discussion that emerged where students were trying to puzzle through, first of all, how to create a 3D structure out of clay around these concepts, and then how to explain those concepts to their classmates. And questions came up. Could you construct Plato's cave without also constructing the city? Or do they only make sense in relationship to each other? Would Hooks place herself inside or outside of a classroom to really express the idea of democratic education? So there was really important, I think, conceptual work going on here. Were students grasping the concepts in the text? But there was also interpretive work, and the discussion moved to whether the visualizations were bringing students' own interpretations and ideas to an ideal education, or were they merely relying on Hooks and Plato? So this exercise and many other discussions that we had about these texts way back in August, I think really set students on a path of thinking about the relationship between classroom and world that echoed through the rest of the semester. We were able to talk about education as an individual project, and Hooks helped them think about that in many ways, but Plato did as well, but also as a social project. And also the potential contradiction between what a society needs and wants from educational structures and what its people need. So I wanted to, I'll speak to this a little bit by returning to the texts and some of the passages that I think most struck our students. For Plato, toward the end of the Allegory, there is a long section about the duty of rulers and the stewards of an ideal city-state. And Plato states very firmly, it is the duty of us, the founders, to compel the best natures to attain the knowledge which we pronounce the greatest, and to win to the vision of the good, to scale that ascent from the cave, and then to go down again among those bondsmen and share their labors and honors. And he goes on to talk about the fact that a city needs king bees, leaders in the hive, people in this second passage who have received a better and more complete education than the others. Down you must go, each in his turn, to the habitation of the others, and accustom yourself to the observation of the obscure things there. Once habituated there, he says, you will discern those things infinitely better than the dwellers there, and you will know what each of the idols is and whereof it is a semblance, because you have seen the reality of the beautiful, the just, and the good. This led, as you might imagine, to all sorts of interesting discussions about elitism and hierarchy, and whether by earning a degree and becoming educated at a research university, one had more to say and more to give to the society than others, which was a very lovely contrast with what they had read and thought about in bell Hooks's work. Bell Hooks, in articulating what she considers to be a democratic and inclusive education, first of all says that the university setting is not the only place to learn, nor is it the place sometimes where the best learning happens. Teaching and learning, she says in this second passage, are taking place constantly. And by doing so, we're actually working to challenge the construction of certain forms of knowledge as always and only available to the elite. She talks too in a way that students were really struck by and contrasted to Plato about the integration of the outside world and the world of the classroom. Hooks talks about the academy having to be informed, for instance, by movements for social justice, particularly anti-racist practice and feminist movements. And she says progressive education absent those movements is important because it may be the only location where individuals can experience support for acquiring a critical consciousness. So here she is, as students recognized, speaking to education as liberation and transcending, in fact, the forms and structures in which one begins. Learning would then serve, she says, to educate students for the practice of freedom rather than the maintenance of existing structures of domination. So as I think it becomes clear by just pulling out these little snippets from Hooks and Plato, there's a lot to work with here in thinking about whether education is part of or separate from the world, whether the intellect is removed, as Plato implies, from human affairs, and is higher than and better than kind of mundane human affairs. There's all kinds of imagery to play with here. The ascent, the move in Plato from darkness to light, lower to upper, and a kind of sharp divide between those who have seen the light versus those who are stuck, waiting for the release from bondage and what passes for wisdom down in the cave. They could think about that alongside Hooks, who suggests we learn always, everywhere, even from human affairs. And this led us in many classrooms into discussions of how does this relate to the communities from which students come and the classrooms that they enter. Are they bridging those spaces, or are they, or is there a kind of divide that they're moving kind of in a passage from darkness to enlightenment that can never be undone? Hooks, in the same essay, talks quite eloquently about the fact that she believes democratic education should not disconnect or alienate students from their world, from the world they come from before, that community and intellectual life can be one. So again, this was very rich fodder for our discussion. And I thought it might be useful to pull from a student reflection here, that clarified this point for me, actually, and for others in that class. She wrote, "Students are not empty vessels who come in search of gaining substance to their lives. Rather, Hooks believes students come already to class with very different lived experiences that give life to learning and transgress academic boundaries." I think a really lovely synopsis that helped this student think about her own movement from her community into the Vanderbilt community and into a seminar community. All of this sort of close reading of texts and pairing of pieces of text broadened out to larger conversations. It led to conversations about the individual desire and quest for an education. Why do people seek to be educated? Can learning be easy, or is it only produced through struggle and discomfort? What's the difference between being coerced or guided to a conclusion? That is, being forced and dragged from a cave, or through a pedagogy of conversation, which is Hooks's favored method. What's the role here of the teacher? And how does an education transform a person? So all of that is kind of on the individual side of education and its function. We also had many wonderful conversations about the social purpose and function of education. These texts allowed students to focus on what a society might need from its educational structures and what its people need. Is the purpose of education truth, the light, or is it liberation? Is its endpoint social order, a rule by philosopher kings, in Plato's rendering? Or is the outcome and desired end of education something else? Is it social justice, what Hooks would call a critical consciousness? And we might call, I suppose, critical thinking. It led to questions about whether everyone could exit the cave, or whether the city in some sense depended on the cave and rulers depended on followers. And of course, also questions about what are the barriers to leaving darkness and becoming educated or enlightened, if that was even the right metaphor to use. Beyond all of this, these readings sparked some really fascinating conversations about the place in all of this, whether the individual or the social view of how education works, for joy and for happiness and transcendence, what Hooks called the magic of the classroom. Or I think in tune with that, Plato's belief that true happiness came from grasping the upper world truly. And so I think these texts in many ways succeeded in what we had set out to do. They raised really big questions for students about the role and responsibility of an education, how to achieve wisdom, and how is that different from a college degree? Was truth out there or produced by struggle and contention? Another set of questions as well about whether education is always good and a means to freedom. Hooks's text really helped them think about the question of education that could misdirect or oppress, that if institutions had been founded on principles of exclusion, that was learning through them being schooled in inherited blinders and prejudices. And it led to really interesting questions about what prevents us from true learning and knowledge of the world. Blinders or shackles, perhaps, ignorance, yes, but also practices of power and domination. As I've suggested, it raised questions for our students about their responsibility about being educated. Not so much did they have a right to rule, but what do you owe to the society from your education? And then finally, what the structure of education has to do with the society that it's in. The last thing I'll say before we move to discussion and any questions is that I think these texts also helped us achieve our other aim, which was to invite students to reflect upon their own educations. There was a lot of wonderful thinking here, and I'm going to skip over these because they're too long. I may come back to them in the Q&A, but there was just such thoughtful cogitation going on these texts, and especially putting them side by side. But what it did even beyond this is to, as I say, allow students to reflect on their own educations. You know, what happens when learning is conflated with rote institutional structures and prerogatives, predetermined answers. A lot of students spoke, I thought, quite poignantly in the discussions around these texts about their own desire to learn being quashed by their education, suppressed by a system of rewards and grades. I heard students say things like, I used to love reading, or if there weren't grades, I would, learn, I would love to do this. Or what I need to take, meaning a class in college, versus what I want to take. Those were pretty common refrains in this discussion. And one student saying, I hope to reclaim in college the part of me that wanted to know more, not for a grade, but because I cared. And another student who wrote, and these were in journal reflections, I expect and hope my college education will not only expand my informational knowledge, that was in quotes, but also animate my imagination and childlike creativity, ultimately bringing back that freedom and color that the school system gradually dulled. So a little painful to hear as a teacher in the classroom, some of these comments, but I think were very illuminating and enlightening way for us to begin thinking about teaching and learning together over the course of the semester. And trying to particularly return to this question of how do we learn to love the classroom again. Plato helps, that was one lesson, but so did these texts. And to say one more word about that, and reflecting on something Andy said right at the outset about the kind of current conditions roiling higher education, I feel like these kinds of texts and these sorts of discussions really wound up anchoring our whole semester with these students. They wrote about them, they returned many times to Plato and to Hooks across the course of the semester. We had them do video reflections about what they had learned at the end, and Hooks and Plato are peppered through those reflections. Right around October 7th and after, we returned to thinking about what the seminar space was for, and what dialogue and citizenship seminar were for, and what that format and allowed us to learn, and how it allowed us to speak in ways that were free and liberating, but also structured. So anyway, these dialogical principles, which came directly from Hooks in some ways, but also from our dialogue about these texts, really were a foundation for the whole semester. So I will close there and see if there are questions or thoughts that people want to raise. And I'm going to just maybe turn back to, so you can see them while people are thinking about, just so you can see some of the wonderful student reflections on these texts.